The meeting had already been going for about 12 minutes when my brother looked directly at me across the conference table and said, loud enough for every person in that room to hear clearly, that this table was for shareholders only, and that perhaps I would be more comfortable waiting outside. There were 11 people in that room. 9 of them I recognized: lawyers, accountants, 2 external investors my brother had brought in over the previous year, and my father's longtime business attorney, a careful and precise man named Gerald, who had managed our family's company legal affairs for longer than I had been alive. The other 2 were people I hadn't met before, younger, clearly associates of the investors, sitting slightly back from the main table with laptops open. All 11 of them looked at me when my brother said it. I reached into the folder I had brought with me, the one I'd been carrying since I left my apartment that morning, and I placed my shareholder certificate on the table in front of me without saying a single word. My name is Angela, and what happened in that conference room on a Tuesday morning is the story of something that had been building quietly for almost 9 years. Finally arriving at a table my brother had just told me I didn't belong at. My father, Richard, built his distribution company from a single warehouse and 2 employees in the early 90s, growing it methodically over 2 decades into a regional operation that employed just over 100 people and served clients across 4 states. He was not a flashy businessman, not the kind of person who talked loudly about his success or decorated his office with trophies of it. He kept the original lease from the first warehouse on the wall behind his desk, framed under glass, as the only decoration that meant anything to him. He told me once, when I was maybe 16, and asking him why he hadn't replaced it with something more impressive, that it reminded him what the beginning actually looked like, so he never mistook the current size of things for the whole story. My brother Marcus is 3 years older than me, and had been involved in the company in an official capacity since his mid-20s, working in operations management, then taking on a broader leadership role as my father's health began requiring him to step back from day-to-day decision-making. Marcus was good at the operational side of the business, genuinely good, in ways I respected without reservation. He understood logistics the way our father did, with a patience for detail and a tolerance for complexity that served the company well. What he was less good at, and what became increasingly visible as he took on more authority, was the distinction between running something and owning it. 8 years before that conference room, when I was 26 and finishing a graduate degree in finance, my father called me into his office on a Saturday morning when the building was otherwise empty. He sat across from me at his desk, the original lease framed behind him, and told me he wanted to talk about something he had been thinking about for several years. He explained, in the careful, methodical way he approached every significant decision, that he had been restructuring the company's ownership framework, partly for estate planning reasons and partly because he had grown increasingly thoughtful about what responsible stewardship of something he had spent his life building actually required. He told me he was transferring 12% of the company's total shares to me directly as a formal ownership stake rather than a future inheritance expectation. He explained his reasoning without making it sentimental, which was consistent with who he was. He said he believed diversity of perspective in ownership was structurally healthy for a company of this size. He said he had observed, over several years, that my financial training and my particular way of analyzing problems would be assets in ownership decisions, even if I was never involved in daily operations. He said, and this was the part I returned to most often in the years that followed, that he wanted someone at the ownership level who would ask the questions that operations focused. People sometimes stopped asking once the day-to-day running of things became their primary orientation. Signed the share transfer paperwork that same morning, with Gerald present as witness, and received the formal certificate documenting my 12% ownership stake in the company my father had built. My father asked me at the end of that conversation not to make this a topic of family discussion in the immediate term. He said he intended to tell Marcus in his own time, in his own way, and that he wanted that conversation to be his to have, rather than something Marcus learned secondhand. I agreed completely, without hesitation. It seemed like a reasonable and private matter between my father and his son. The problem was that my father's own time, in his own way, never quite arrived. His health deteriorated more quickly over the following 2 years than any of us had anticipated. His involvement in the company wound down faster than planned, and Marcus stepped into a fuller leadership role during a period when my father had less capacity for the difficult peripheral conversations that weren't immediately required by the business's daily functioning. The share transfer remained in the company's legal records, properly filed and documented, but never discussed directly within the family. Marcus ran the company with the confidence of someone who believed he understood the full picture of its ownership. For 8 years, he did not. I want to be honest about my own role in those 8 years, because honesty requires acknowledging that I had choices during that period that I did not exercise, and that my silence was a decision I made repeatedly, rather than a condition that simply happened to me. My father had asked me not to raise it immediately, and I had honored that, but my father's death 4 years into those 8 years removed the immediate reason for my silence without me actually revisiting whether continuing to be silent still made sense. The truth is that I observed Marcus's growing confidence in his complete authority over the company with a complicated mix of feelings that I processed privately rather than acting on directly. Part of me was genuinely invested in the company's success and recognized that Marcus's operational leadership, whatever its other qualities, was keeping the business stable during a difficult transition period. Part of me was conflict-averse in the specific way of someone who had spent a lifetime being the quieter sibling, the one whose things worked themselves out, the one who absorbed rather than confronted. And part of me, the part I am least proud of in retrospect, simply waited, watching the picture become clearer, knowing that at some point the legal reality of my ownership would surface in a context that made it impossible to continue being ignored. The investor conversations were what finally made that context arrive. Marcus had spent the year before the meeting I'm describing negotiating with 2 external investment groups interested in taking a minority stake in the company, a process that required formal documentation of the existing ownership structure that could not be completed without accounting for my 12%. Gerald had raised this with Marcus several weeks before the scheduled meeting, I learned later, in a private conversation I was not present for. Marcus's response to that information, and the series of decisions he made in the days between learning it and the morning of the meeting, told me more about the previous 8 years than anything that had happened during them. He did not call me. He did not send a message asking to talk before the meeting. He did not contact Gerald to ask for a recommended approach to the situation. What he did was schedule the shareholder meeting, list the attendees, and apparently decide that my presence in that conference room was something he could simply manage in the moment, with 11 people watching, in a way that would resolve the inconvenience of my documented ownership stake without requiring him to have a private conversation about it first. I arrived at the company's offices on that Tuesday morning with the folder Gerald had helped me prepare the week before, after he had quietly reached out to me directly, not because he was taking sides in any family matter, but because, as he explained on the phone with careful professional neutrality, there were legal realities pertaining to my ownership position that needed to be properly represented at the meeting, regardless of any other considerations. Gerald was, above everything else, thorough, and thoroughness in this situation required my presence and my documentation. The conference room was already occupied when I arrived, the investors and their associates seated, Gerald at the far end of the table with his own folder open in front of him. Marcus was standing near the whiteboard, mid-conversation with one of the lead investors, and turned when I came in with an expression I recognized from childhood, the particular expression of someone recalculating a situation they had expected to control. He said hello to me in a tone that managed to be simultaneously civil and clearly communicating that my presence was unexpected, and then returned to his conversation. I sat down at the table, placed my folder in front of me, and waited. Gerald and I made brief eye contact across the room. He gave nothing away, which was precisely what I had expected from him. The meeting began formally, Marcus presenting an overview of the company's current financial position, growth trajectory, and the proposed terms of the investment arrangement he had been negotiating. He was polished and confident, the way he always was in professional settings, presenting information he understood deeply in language calibrated for an outside audience. I listened carefully, taking occasional notes, saying nothing. It was at the point where Marcus began discussing the company's current ownership structure as context for the investment terms that things shifted. He described a straightforward picture, himself as primary operational leader and majority stakeholder, my father's estate holding the remaining shares through an estate management arrangement that was still being formally processed. Clean, simple, the kind of ownership picture that made an investor's due diligence straightforward. Gerald cleared his throat quietly at the end of Marcus's description and said, with the careful precision of someone who had thought through every word in advance, that there was an additional ownership position that needed to be formally represented in the meeting before the investment structure discussion could proceed accurately. Marcus looked at Gerald with an expression that lasted approximately 2 seconds before being replaced by something more composed. But those 2 seconds were visible to everyone at the table. That was when Marcus turned to me and told me this table was for shareholders only, and suggested I might be more comfortable waiting outside. And I reached into my folder and placed my certificate on the table. The room was very quiet for a moment. One of the lead investors leaned forward slightly to read what was on the document in front of me. Gerald opened a page in his own folder that I recognized as the corresponding company record. Marcus looked at the certificate, then at Gerald, then at me, in a sequence that covered perhaps 4 seconds, and communicated more than any of the words that came afterward. Gerald spoke first, in the same careful professional tone he had maintained throughout. He confirmed for the room that the certificate represented a valid and properly documented 12% ownership stake in the company, transferred by my father 8 years prior, reflected accurately in the company's legal ownership records. He noted that this position had been disclosed to Marcus prior to the meeting. He suggested the group might benefit from a brief recess before continuing the ownership structure discussion with complete and accurate information on the table. The lead investor, a precise and experienced man who had clearly navigated complicated situations before, agreed to the recess without visible reaction in either direction, which struck me as the most professional thing anyone did in that room during those few minutes. His associate closed his laptop. The other investor looked at Marcus with an expression that was carefully neutral, but not entirely empty. Marcus and I stepped out of the conference room together during the recess, into a small adjacent space that was technically a kitchenette, but functioned in that moment as the location for a conversation that probably should have happened 8 years earlier, or 4 years earlier when our father died, or at any of the numerous intermediate points where it would have been less complicated and less public than a conference room with 11 witnesses. He asked me, his voice lower than it had been in the meeting, how long I had known about the shares. I told him truthfully, 8 years, since the Saturday morning our father had called me into his office. He asked me why I hadn't said anything. I told him also truthfully that our father had asked me to let him have that conversation in his own time, and that after our father died I had made choices about continuing the silence that I was not entirely proud of in retrospect. He was quiet for a moment, then said that Gerald had told him about the shares 3 weeks before the meeting. I told him I knew. He didn't ask me why I thought he hadn't called me in those 3 weeks, and I didn't offer my theory, because the conference room was waiting, and some things can be said more clearly when the immediate situation has been resolved. The meeting resumed after the recess with the ownership structure accurately represented. The investors, to their credit, were professional throughout the remainder of the session, asking precise questions about the implications of the full ownership picture for the proposed investment terms, receiving precise answers from Gerald, and ultimately expressing continued interest in the investment arrangement, with updated documentation reflecting the actual structure rather than the simplified version. Marcus had presented initially the formal conversations about restructuring the ownership framework for the investment took several weeks to complete after that initial meeting, involving multiple sessions with lawyers and accountants, and eventually Marcus and me sitting across from each other in Gerald's office without anyone else present, which was where the actual substance of everything got addressed rather than managed. Those conversations were difficult in the specific way of difficult conversations that are also genuinely necessary, the kind where the discomfort is the point rather than an obstacle to it. Marcus told me in one of those sessions that he had genuinely not known about the share transfer for the 8 years preceding Gerald's disclosure, that our father had not had the conversation he had intended to have, and that learning about it the way he had, 3 weeks before a meeting with outside investors, had produced a reaction in him that he acknowledged was not his best. I believed him about not knowing, because the alternative required believing our father had deliberately deceived his own son for years, in a way that was inconsistent with everything I understood about who my father was. The share transfer had been a decision our father made carefully, and with good reasons, and the conversation he had intended to follow it had simply never happened, the way some important conversations don't, when circumstances don't cooperate with intentions. I told Marcus, in return, that my silence after our father's death had not served either of us well, that I had allowed a legal reality to sit unaddressed for 4 years, partly out of conflict avoidance, and partly out of a waiting posture that I recognized, in retrospect, as one of my less useful tendencies. That acknowledgement mattered to me to make, because accuracy about my own choices seemed as important as accuracy about anyone else's. The investment ultimately proceeded, with restructured terms that reflected the actual ownership picture, and included formal representation of my shareholder position in the ongoing governance structure of the company. This was not something I had gone to that meeting specifically to achieve. I had gone because Gerald had reached out, and because my presence was legally required for the meeting to proceed accurately. But it was the outcome that made the most structural sense once everything was on the table, and Marcus, to his credit, arrived at that conclusion himself, rather than requiring it to be argued for at length. My relationship with Marcus since that morning is different from what it was before it. Not broken, not simple, but different in the specific way of relationships that have been required to become honest, rather than continuing to operate comfortably on assumptions that were never fully examined. We talk more directly now than we did during the 8 years when a significant legal reality sat silently between us, which is, I think, a reasonable outcome of a situation that was always going to require that directness eventually. I think often about the framed lease my father kept on the wall behind his office desk. The one from the original warehouse, the one he told me reminded him what the beginning actually looked like, so he never mistook the current size of things for the whole story. I have a photograph of it, taken during one of my visits to his office years before he died. I keep it somewhere I see it regularly. It reminds me of several things simultaneously, about what my father built and why it mattered to him, about the conversation he intended to have and didn't quite manage to have in time, and about the importance of not letting significant truths sit in folders waiting for the right moment to surface. Because the right moment, if you wait long enough for it to arrive on its own, has a way of choosing its own timing regardless. A conference table with 11 witnesses is not the ideal setting for 8 years of unaddressed reality to finally arrive. But it arrived, and what came after it, the difficult sessions in Gerald's office, and the restructured terms, and the more honest relationship with my brother, was more valuable than the comfort of continuing to wait would have been. Some things are better said directly, with documentation if necessary, in whatever room happens to be available when the moment finally comes.